Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Super excited for this video as we're going to dive into the luxury tax situations for all 30 NBA teams. This is some of my favorite kind of content to record because we get to discuss every single team in the NBA all in one video. It's a fun topic to record on, especially because there's a lot of questions around how the financial implications of the NBA, specifically the CBA, and kind of the way that teams operate, how does that impact the trade deadline specifically? And that's the entire point behind today's video. We're going to discuss how I think the luxury tax is likely going to impact all 30 NBA teams. For some teams, it's not a big deal. For some teams, it's a very important topic, especially this trade deadline. So let's jump into it. If you guys are new, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. And when it comes to a video preview, we're going to look at 4 different categories. There are teams that are way over the tax. There are teams that are barely above the tax, teams that are barely under the tax, and then also teams that are significantly below the tax line. So those 4 teams all have different agendas this trade deadline for different reasons, whether they're contending, rebuilding, looking to add talent. And it's funny because there's teams that are, say, way below the tax that still are a contending team, like the Oklahoma City Thunder, who we'll talk about later in this video. But there's also teams that are either way over the tax or right hovering around the tax that are also viewed as contenders currently. So it's important to break down how that's going to impact each of these different teams come NBA trade deadline time for our live streams that we'll have on the channel. So let's start here with the way above the tax teams. And there's really 3 groups of teams that are way above the tax line this year. There are teams that are for sure above the second apron. And what is the second apron? Well, it's the luxury tax plus this season $17.5 million extra on top of that. So teams that are above that luxury tax line and the $17.5 million marker that are significantly above that are the Golden State Warriors, who are $41 million above the tax, the Los Angeles Clippers, who are $34.76 million above the luxury tax, and the Phoenix Suns are over $21 million above the luxury tax. Now, one thing we're going to say about these 3 teams, they all have the same goal in mind: win NBA titles. The Clippers haven't been able to get it done with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, but when you have Steve Ballmer as your owner, you're building a brand new arena with the wall in the arena, and the Intuit Dome just seems like it's going to be a crazy place to witness a basketball game. They've got the money to afford being so significantly far into the tax. Of course, the Golden State Warriors have been printing money with their new arena and also winning as much as they have over the last decade or so. But I think we're starting to see some of the issues with operating that way, especially when it comes to flexibility, especially with the new CBA. And the Phoenix Suns, I mean, they pigeonholed themselves into this when they traded for Bradley Beal. I said that was a disaster the moment that they did that. Not only has Bradley Beal missed a ton of time with injury, even though he's a really good player, with the new CBA and the financial implications, they've just put themselves in a tough spot where, look, they're going to be above the second apron. This year is kind of a little bit of a loose season. The NBA is not enforcing all of the rules because it's kind of a bridge year between last CBA and this CBA. But next year is when we start to see a lot of those problems. The Warriors are still going to be faced with some of those issues. The Clippers will be faced with a lot of those issues, especially since Kawhi just signed an extension. Paul George likely will, and James Harden will. And then the Suns, well, I mean, they committed themselves to a big 3 with 2 of them being well into their 30s. That's going to be a problem for them quite a bit as well moving forward. And with that, you're going to have teams that are, losing their draft picks. Those you're not going to be able to trade. You're not going to be able to aggregate salaries and trades. Your picks are frozen. You can't make trades with them. So there's just a lot of issues if you're in that second apron level. Then you look at teams that are straddling the second apron. And again, this year, it's not as huge of a deal, but we are going to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks and Boston Celtics a bit more because I do see it as a possibility for them to try and wiggle below that second apron line. Right now, the Milwaukee Bucks are about $750,000 over that second apron marker, and so are the Boston Celtics, both of them about $18.3 million over the luxury tax currently. And then there's a few teams that are comfortably below that second apron right now. The Miami Heat at about $15 million over the luxury tax line gives them about $2.5 million of flexibility below that line. So if they do need to fit in one more guy on a buyout contract or a minimum, they're going to be able to do that. And then the Denver Nuggets at about $13 million over the luxury tax. They have about $4.5 million to work with, still staying below the second apron. All of these teams are above, of course, the first apron, but these teams right now are all pretty comfortable with where they're at above the tax. I think that they're all viewed as contenders for the most part. Obviously, the Warriors and Suns haven't really played that way this season, but you're still looking at teams that have legitimate playoff chances in the postseason, that once they get there, they're going to be a tough team to take down, and that's partially why they're in this area. But when we specifically focus on the Bucks and Celtics, I do see it possible that these two teams try and wiggle below that second apron line, and they both can do that with a small salary dump. Now, that's going to look a little bit different for both of these teams. For the Celtics, it's a pretty easy decision and a pretty easy move to make. Svi Mykhailiuk is a guy who, in my trade predictions video, I said that the Celtics likely salary dump him somewhere, get him off of their books, probably sign a younger guy to a minimum contract, still have a filled out roster, but off of that, they're going to be able to be below the second apron level, which again, just I think moving forward, the more often you can shed salary and save a little bit of money, especially in the tax, that saving on Svi Mykhailiuk might result in the owners there in Boston saving about $7.5 million. That's a pretty big deal. Then you look at the Milwaukee Bucks, and it's a little bit more difficult for them because they have a lot of young players that are on cheap contracts they don't want to give up, like MarJon Beauchamp, Andre Jackson Jr. Those are guys you would presume become key pieces for Milwaukee moving forward. But then you also have guys who are cheap but are pretty important into their rotation. For example, Cam Payne or Jay Crowder. Those are two examples where if they want to shed a $2 million salary, it's a little bit more difficult. And you might say, well, they have some guys at the end of the bench. Well, those guys happen to be Thanasis Antetokounmpo and Robin Lopez. So are you going to upset one of your players by trading their brother away? That's kind of challenging. Now, they do have Pat Connaughton, $9 million. And I'm not saying to salary dump Pat Connaughton. What I'm saying is they might use him in a trade and see if they can target a player making $7 or $8 million that they really like. For example, Alex Caruso. Now, I don't know if the Bucks have enough to get a guy like Alex Caruso, but with his contract, they could effectively trade Connaughton for Caruso, maybe throw in a ton of second-round picks. They don't really have a ton to work with, the Milwaukee Bucks don't, so they'd have to be very creative. You maybe even have to attach one of MarJon Beauchamp or Andre Jackson Jr., which is a big question of, do you want to do that? But given, Caruso's value, it doesn't even have to be Caruso either. It could be other players around the league that, again, makes below $9 million. If they make less than $9 million, a Connaughton flip with that team does make some sense, especially if the Bucks incentivize it a little bit with some second-round picks in the deal. Not really super important news, but I do think it's worth looking at and gives us a good insight to what these teams might potentially look to do. For teams that are barely above the tax, here are the Philadelphia 76ers, who are only $4.3 million above the tax line, and the Los Angeles Lakers are just $1.27 million above the tax line. So you might be wondering, well, what would these teams do to contend at the deadline? Because that's a big prerogative for these franchises. The Sixers want to win a title with Joel Embiid at some point. Tyrese Maxey's been playing the best basketball of his career. And for the Lakers, when you have 39-year-old LeBron James playing like a top 10, top 15 player in the league still, and Anthony Davis is arguably having the best season of his career, your aspirations should be title. And it's hard to do that right now, especially when the Lakers just aren't very good. Their spacing is tough. Now, they did have a big win just the other night on national TV over the Dallas Mavericks, but I still think there's room for both of these teams to improve and add some talent to their roster, but it's kind of tricky figuring out a way to do that given their salary situations. For the Sixers, it's a bit easier to view them getting below that tax line in a few different ways. They have multiple tradable contracts that I think could help them inch below that tax line. This is something the Sixers did last year. They traded out contracts at the trade deadline and got below the tax, so I'm almost certain, I would actually 100% bet on it, that the 76ers consider doing this again this trade deadline. And you might say, okay, well, what do they have to work with? Daniil House makes a little bit over $4 million. Furkan Korkmaz might finally get his trade request validated in this, where he's making $5 million, and Marcus Morris is an expiring $17 million deal. All three of these guys have played 20-plus games for the Sixers this year. Marcus Morris has played, I believe, 31 games at the time I'm recording this. They're all expendable. None of these players are huge pieces for the Sixers rotation. They could easily trade these players out and probably replace their minutes rather comfortably, assuming that they make a buy move. And I think that's the really interesting thing with the Sixers. After the James Harden trade, they have extra picks to work with. Could they attach a first round pick and an expiring salary in Marcus Morris to get a player, say, maybe making 12 to 13 or $14 million? And if that's the answer, if they get a guy making $13 million, well, you already have shed some of that salary. Maybe you attach a Jaden Springer into that, and all of a sudden you're below the tax line while still making a buy move. And I think that's the genius here that maybe Philadelphia is able to figure out, is what guy right now is on a mid-level exception that they would want to add into their team that isn't making a ton of money moving forward because they still want their cap flexibility this offseason. They might be able to find a player like that out on the market right now. Again, I mentioned Alex Caruso earlier for the Milwaukee Bucks. I think he makes a ton of sense for the Philadelphia 76ers as well. Maybe they're able to string in other pieces into that deal. They give up a first-round pick and expiring salary for Alex Caruso, who's cheap enough to fit into next year's salary line anyway if you're Philadelphia. That makes a good deal of sense to me too. He's also retradable if that's the decision that they want to make in the offseason. The Sixers are a really clear picture on how to get under the tax while still improving their roster, and I think that's an obvious decision that they're going to make this trade deadline. When we look at the Los Angeles Lakers, their situation's a little bit foggier because how do you improve the team? D'Angelo Russell's had some awesome moments in the last couple of weeks. I still don't believe in him. I think that if I'm the Lakers, I'm looking to trade D'Angelo Russell, and I think the player that likely gets attached with him to sweeten deals, former number 17 overall pick of the 2023 NBA draft, Jalen Hood-Schifino. I like this kid a lot coming out of Indiana. The big question with him, which is why it was a little perplexing that the Lakers drafted him, is he going to hit enough threes? And I think if you look at the Lakers just in general this year, they ranked dead last in the NBA in three-point attempts per game. Hood-Schifino is not, of course, a big part of their rotation currently. He's more of a developmental project, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with taking a developmental project 17th overall. But the question for me was, does he even fit with the team? And you took him 17th overall as a development project when someone like Jaime Jaquez was available, when someone like Cam Whitmore was available, who, you know, you can sit here and say, well, they missed on this, this, and this. I still think Hood-Schifino is an interesting prospect, and that's why I think teams around the league would view him positively. So maybe there's a trade out there. Of course, there's been DeJounte Murray rumored to the Lakers a ton, where if you trade Hood-Schifino, D'Angelo Russell, and say a 2030 first-round pick, or 2029 first round pick, that's actually the smarter decision, because then once the new league year rolls over, the Lakers would still have a tradable first in 2031 if they wanted to operate that way. The Lakers would, again, get under the tax and likely improve their team with DeJounte Murray. Now, I don't think he's the best fit in LA. I think that there's other situations that would be way better for him to get traded into, but it's the Lakers. They value all-stars. They value guys with big, recognizable names. DeJounte Murray fits that category, so that's something to consider. You also have to look at other players around the league making anywhere from $13 to $20 million. And with the Lakers' current collection of players making anywhere from 10, like Gabe Vincent, to about $18, $20 million like D'Angelo Russell and Rui Hachimura, they have trade flexibility in here with a sweetener like Jalen Hood-Schifino to add in to get below the tax line, which is pretty important. For those of you who do not know, if you get under the tax, you actually get a redistribution from all of the teams in the tax. So a team like when we talked about the Clippers, who are $35+ million over the tax, well, they're going to cut a check basically to the league, and the league is going to redistribute that money across all of the teams that are below the tax. So being above the tax means you pay in, being below the tax means you get a paid check. So that's a pretty big deal, and that's why a lot of owners, specifically if it's not going to significantly impact the way that your roster performs, it's worthwhile to get below the tax. It makes your owner happy, and it's just good financial practices for a GM or president of basketball operations. So when we get into teams that are barely under the tax, there's a bunch of them here. I have a bunch of teams here between that $1.7 million below the tax to about $10 million below the tax. And there's not a lot to break down here other than when these teams are making trades, you have to be super cautious when you're putting trades together in the trade machine. For example, the Chicago Bulls, they're a fascinating team right now because they are going to likely look to trade Zach LaVine. Who knows about DeMar DeRozan? Potentially he could be available. Kobe White's had an awesome season so far this year. Some things have gone right for Chicago. A lot of things haven't gone right for Chicago. So a lot of people are painting them as a seller, but if you're having them sell, they can't take back $1.8 million extra salary because they just won't do that, I promise. If they make a trade and they take back more than $1.71 million in salary, there's got to be another move coming because the Bulls are not going to sell off pieces and enter the tax. That just makes zero sense. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, quite a different story. They are a team that, listen, contenders this year. They are that good. They are a great defense. They've got a ton of talent. They've got 5 guys who are high-quality starters. Naz Reid is arguably the 6th man of the year right now coming off the bench. Kyle Anderson and Nickeil Alexander-Walker are both good bench pieces as well there in Minnesota. This team is probably a small piece away from feeling really comfortable about themselves come playoff time. So if you're looking for trades for Minnesota, they have contracts like Shake Milton or Troy Brown Jr. that you could attach into deals. But I think the big thing, if you're the Wolves, you're not going to move into the tax. So even if they're trading 3 players for 1, you have to be really careful about that, because then if they added minimum contracts, all of a sudden they're above the tax, and that's a huge no-no for the Timberwolves, especially since with Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels extensions kicking in next season, the team is already headed toward being a second apron team, which is absolutely bonkers for a team based in Minnesota, small market. This team has historically never that far into the luxury tax, almost never even touches the tax in general. So because of that, even though they're really good, you have to be careful. They don't want to start entering repeater tax and paying the benefits, or excuse me, the consequences of that. So I think that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, even for a contender like Minnesota. The Pelicans, they already made their move. And in fact, in my trade deadline predictions video, they made the exact move I said they would. It's very obvious. And that's why the whole point of this video exists right now that you're watching, is because it's very obvious what teams are going to do when you look at their actual cap table. The Pelicans were about $2.5 million over the luxury tax, and in my video I said I guarantee you they dumped Kyra Lewis Jr. in a salary dump move to get under the tax. That was my prediction for the team. They did that in the Pascal Siakam trade literally a day after I recorded it. Really funny timing on that, honestly. But with that being the case, the Pelicans now below the tax, and I'm sure that they feel pretty content with their roster. The Cavaliers, $3.2 million, Mavericks, $3.46. I think the Cavaliers and Mavs are both going to look to be active. The Mavericks a little bit more so, in my opinion, trying to put a winning product around Luka Doncic. So again, if you're making trades with them, you can bring in up to about $3.5 million in salary, but you have to be careful. You don't want this team entering the tax. Now, they do have new ownership. Maybe, just maybe, Mark Cuban is going to, as the kind of leader of the basketball operation still, is he going to be okay with entering the tax? Of course he will be. The question is the owner ready for that already in year 1? The Portland Trailblazers, New York Knicks, teams that, listen, the Blazers maybe trade Jeremy Grant. They've got a lot of room. Like these teams here between Portland, New York, Brooklyn, Toronto, Memphis, with a lot of their kind of work already done. The Knicks already made a trade. The Nets seem like they're going to be sellers. The Raptors have already made a bunch of trades. They have Bruce Brown yet to trade at the time I'm recording this. These teams are not close enough to the tax that you have to really worry about them. The reason I went as far down as I did, though, was the Atlanta Hawks. A little bit more room, about $10 million below the tax. But the reason that they really matter, it sounds like they're really going to be intent on selling. And that means DeJounte Murray, that means Clint Capella, that means DeAndre Hunter. It could mean a lot of different players in Atlanta. So if they're making 3 or 4 sell trades at the deadline, they can afford to take in some salary as a surplus on a few of them. But if they take $2 or $3 million as a surplus on 4 different trades, all of a sudden they're right on the tax line. So I thought it was very important to mention the Atlanta Hawks here, with even though $10 million below the tax currently, there's still a little bit of concern there that if they're not careful, they'd get pretty close to that tax line. So if you're making a bunch of mock trades for the Atlanta Hawks, that's something you have to keep in consideration. So let's jump into teams that are way under the tax. We have the Oklahoma City Thunder, Sacramento Kings, Washington Wizards, Houston Rockets, the Indiana Pacers, who have already made their big splashy move, the San Antonio Spurs, Utah Jazz, Charlotte Hornets, who are likely going to sell Terry Rozier, the Detroit Pistons, and the Orlando Magic. And I think a couple of things I want to touch on. First of all, look at the different level of team play in some of these categories. The Rockets are a 500 basketball team. The Thunder are a contender. The Pacers probably internally view themselves as contenders, and I can't argue with it too much because they have one of the top 10 players in the world right now, Tyrese Halliburton, and on top of that, they just brought in an all-NBA forward or all-star level forward in Pascal Siakam. You have the teams that are fully rebuilding. The Pistons, Spurs, obviously the Hornets perennially rebuilding. The Wizards are in here, which I'm still very fond of what they're doing. Their long-term decision-making, I think, has been really solid since Michael Winger came in. We'll see if they're a team that's active this trade deadline. I expect them to be. I think this is the best sign for the NBA. Like, you have teams that are way below the tax, and they're still really good. And you have teams that are way below the tax that are intentionally bad. And I think that's okay. You have teams that, listen, tanking and rebuilding, while yes, it doesn't sell as many tickets, it actually, I think, in my opinion, increases fan interest. A lot of people want to know, what players could we get in the draft? Who are we going to add? Now, of course, you don't want to be bad like the Detroit Pistons have been for quite a while. You want to be able to get back to the playoffs relatively quickly. Like a rapid rebuild like what we saw from the Pacers is the best thing to see. But really the most important thing about this video for these teams specifically that you see on the graphic now, these teams are specifically centered in a way that they're going to be able to make any trade that they really want. Given the trade rules in the NBA, these teams have a ton of flexibility. We already saw Indiana make a big splashy trade, and they still have a lot of room against the tax. There's room for these teams to be aggressive, to make any type of move that they want without really having to worry about the financial component. So props to these teams for putting themselves in that position. These teams are a little bit more lenient in what their decisions will end up looking like, and that's really the most important thing to touch on. For these 10 teams, this is 33% of the league that has significant room against the tax. So that's a very important nugget from this video, is now you know which teams are going to have a little bit more flexibility, which teams are going to look to get under the tax, which teams are going to look to get aggressive and maybe add in some salary because they're way under the tax. There's a lot in there. There's some teams that are so far above the tax that they're already screwed anyway, that they're not going to even worry about the tax this season. So that's, your Clippers, that's your Phoenix Suns, that's your Golden State Warriors. Those teams are going to be more focused on trying to win and contend. Some of these other teams might be able to take advantage of that, maximize value, and extract extra draft picks or young players from those types of teams as well. So it's a fascinating situation. And right now, it is the calm before the storm. The lakes are smooth. Everything is silent after the Pascal Siakam trade. Bruce Brown, there's going to be rumors that circulate about him, but this is a reminder. Things are about to get hectic. This is the place you want to be to keep up on all of that NBA trade news. I spend a ton of time. The amount of time I spend on Spot Track and all of these other cap management sites is insane. I spend so much time on there. And I feel like because of that, I'm very well versed for this time of the year, especially during trade deadline live streams. Those will be coming soon. I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.